So hello and welcome everyone to the second instalment of the 2022 Southwest Marine Ecosystem webinar series. My name is Helen Chadwick and I'm one of the project coordinators for Exeter Marine Research Network at the University of Exeter, based in Penrhyn, on the Penrhyn campus in Cornwall. So the University of Exeter are hosting 3 sessions in this series. We had one on cetaceans last week, which you can watch on the Southwest Marine Ecosystems YouTube channel. And today we'll be having one on climate change, and then next week we have one on seals. There are several more sessions which will be hosted by our institutional partners at the Marine Biological Association, which cover a broad range of marine topics. So if you miss any of the sessions, including today's, then don't worry, because they will all be recorded and uploaded to the Southwest Marine Ecosystems YouTube channel. And just some housekeeping, do feel free to keep your cameras on. You won't be able to unmute yourselves. So if you have any questions for Claire, please do pop them in the chat and we'll pick them up at the end. So to continue the series, today we have the wonderful Claire Wallerstein, who has recently produced a series of documentaries about climate change impacts and solutions in Cornwall, which is called Climate Care Stories. So I'll be sharing Claire's slides for her, but she will be doing all the presenting. So just bear with me one sec and I'll get your presentation up. Okay, can you see that? Yep.
Am I good to go?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Oh, thanks, Helen, and thanks everyone for welcoming me here. Just it's a little bit complicated because maybe we should have chosen the names better, but the charity is called Cornwall Climate Care and the series of documentaries that we're making is called Cornwall's Climate Stories. So I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about the first 3 films in the series, as these were all marine related. Yeah, thanks. Can we have the next slide?
Oops.
So I don't know whether some of you might know me already. I'm not a scientist at all. My background, though, is in generally being very passionate about marine plastic pollution. So I moved back to the UK from Spain in 2010, and soon after that set up a marine conservation and beach cleaning group called Rain Peninsula Beach Care, mainly because I was coming across scenes like this on the beaches. You know, 8, 9, 10 years ago, this is what our beaches looked like a lot of the time. Not so bad now, because so many groups have done such amazing stuff, picking up a lot of the big stuff that have been lying around for decades. But yeah, we were often coming across scenes like this. This, of course, is a guillemot dead among a whole heap of plastic. Probably not what caused the death of the guillemot, but just I thought quite a good image to sort of show the environment within which our marine wildlife is battling at the moment. Next slide, please, Helen. And, you know, we all see the images of albatrosses and whales and animals on the other side of the world that's being impacted by terrible amounts of marine plastic pollution in the Pacific Gyre and places like that. But this is something that's really happening here. So, you know, from the plankton, the zooplankton up in the top left, you know, consuming tiny bits of microplastics, right down to that bottom left picture, which is actually Matty Witt doing an autopsy in situ of a basking shark, and when its stomach was opened up, what you can see inside there is a piece of plastic sheeting inside its stomach. So this is one environmental issue that's having a massive impact on our local marine wildlife. Next slide, please. So yeah, so set up Rain Peninsula Beach Care. I ran it for 8 years. We did hundreds and hundreds of beach cleans, removed tons of plastic, did a lot of campaigning around all sorts of things to do with plastic pollution. I also helped to set up the Cornish Plastic Pollution Coalition, which is a grouping of over 50 marine conservation and beach cleaning groups. And you know, it's just such an obvious problem, isn't it? Marine plastic, it's so visible. We can see what the impact is. It's also quite clear what the solutions are, and it's a great sort of thing for bringing communities together, because it's something we can all get our hands on and do something about. Next slide, please. But over time, I started going to more and more conferences and events, and I started to have conversations with marine scientists who started sort of opening my eyes to something else, really. And I think really it was a conversation with Brendan Godley at an event a few years ago, when he was saying, well, yes, you know, of course, marine plastic pollution, incredibly important, huge crisis, but is this going to actually lead on to wider public understanding and concern about other major issues that we're not really sort of focusing on much in the public debate at all, like climate change and the impact that that's having on the ocean? Thank you. Next slide. So I went away and I started to think, I wonder if climate change really isn't as much of an issue in Cornwall as plastic pollution is. So over the course of Rain Peninsula Beach Care, I'd worked quite a lot with a filmmaker called Bryony Stokes to make a few sort of short films about various campaigns that we were doing. And I started talking to her about this quite a bit, and we thought, you know, it would be a great thing to investigate, because film is such a powerful medium, and if it really is having a big effect here that we're not, you know, that people aren't aware of, maybe this would be a really good way of engaging people by showing them that it's something locally relevant. You know, it's not just something that's affecting polar bears and coral reefs and people on Pacific Islands. You know, why don't we look at what's happening here in Cornwall? Next slide, please. So we started to think, and we thought, well, yes, you know, there are a few things that we're aware of actually where there really is an issue of climate being an aspect in situations here. So I'd been involved in the project to monitor the spread of Pacific oysters around Cornwall. We'd done quite a lot of volunteering along Whitsand Bay and around the estuaries and creeks here. Of course, these Pacific oysters, which were brought here in the 50s for farming in oyster farms around Cornwall, were never supposed to be able to reproduce in our waters because they were too cold. But of course, you know, now something's happening, the water is warming, and you know, that may be part of the reason why these feral oysters are spreading and popping up all over Cornwall. Next slide, please. I'd also got personal experience of something else. Obviously, you know, warmer waters leading to increasing storminess. I personally lived through those 2014 storms. So my house, where I lived at the time, was only a little bit along to the right of this picture. I'd grown up there. I'd experienced bad storms, you know, periodically throughout my life. But on this occasion, I actually ended up running for my life with my children. Something that I never thought would ever happen. That definitely really concentrates the mind. And found out afterwards, of course, that storm was actually so small, it didn't even have a name. It was a named storm, but because it happened, it was like the perfect storm because it happened at high tide on a spring tide with, you know, the right wind direction and the right atmospheric conditions. It was devastating, which really sort of replicates what is likely to happen as sea levels rise. You know, it doesn't have to be a huge storm, just the fact that it's acting on this higher sea level is going to have a much bigger impact. Next slide, please, Helen. And I think the real light bulb moment for me was talking to this guy. So this is a fisherman called Jason Pascoe. He fishes out of Coombe Creek down on the River Fowle. He's a fantastic guy. As you can see, he loves seabirds. He really, really loves the gulls that come and roost on his boat. And he'd got in touch because he was very concerned with the gulls' regurgitation pellets that he was finding on the boat. Instead of only finding, you know, bits of shell and crab claw and stuff, he also realised that there was lots and lots of plastic in them. So he sent me one of these pellets, and we'd been, you know, looking at what they were, and this coincided with an investigation we'd been doing into biobeads being used in Southwest Water's waste treatment plants. Clearly, this gull had eaten a lot of those, even though the spill was over 10 years earlier. But while we were filming him talking about this, he started actually chatting about the changes that he was seeing as a fisherman due to the changes in water temperature in the water and all the different species that were coming into our waters. And we thought, hang on, you know, this is another story. You know, we've got all these stories. We might have a film here. Next slide, please, Helen. So we decided to make a short film about marine climate change, looking at things to do with fishing, storms and coastal erosion, and also just general impacts on the marine environment. luckily, you know, over the years working with Rain Peninsula Beach Care, we'd had contact with so many fantastic people throughout the network who are working on all sorts of aspects. So we started chatting to people to see if they had any thoughts about climate change and whether it was really affecting anything to do with what they were studying. It turned out pretty much everyone had something to say. So what we thought was initially going to be one short 10-minute film, in the end became 3 half-hour documentaries. Next slide, please, Helen. So the first one, which came out just over a year ago, Under the Surface, this one is looking at marine climate change impacts on our marine environment, habitats and species. Next slide, please. So the impact it looked at is, you know, what's happening as a result of climate change to our plankton populations, basking sharks, kittiwake seals, and nesting seabirds on Scilly. But we also focus quite a lot of positive stories and inspirational things, because what we're really trying to do with these films is not only be doom and gloom. We want very much to focus on solutions as a way of engaging people and you know, motivating them and not just making them feel hopeless and switching off. Next slide, please. So we're just going to show now a little excerpt from that first film, and then I'm going to talk about the second two.
Storminess as our climate changes is a problem for many marine animals too. Sue Sayer has dedicated the past 20 years of her life to studying Cornwall's grey seals, and she took me out onto the cliffs near where she lives to explain more.
Seals in Cornwall are very special because they are at the southernmost range of their species range. In the UK, we've got 34% of the world's population, but even so, there are more red squirrels in the UK than there are grey seals. So this is not a massively numerate population. 2017 was the start of a potential series of years that have been very difficult and challenging for seals during the pupping season. Storm Brian was a storm that occurred in October, start of the pupping season, on a big spring tide of the year at high tide. And these massive swells probably washed off every seal pup that was alive on the Scillies at the time, washed them off all their beaches away from their mothers. The following year there was a really interesting impact. We think what happened is lots of mums lost their pups. They had complications like mastitis because they weren't able to get rid of their milk and feed their pups. And they then had hormonal issues, so they didn't mate when they should have mated. So the following year we had something like a 43 to 46% drop in pup numbers, potentially because of the complications of the storms the previous year. It's like if you lose your child and you've got milk, let alone all the emotional stuff, you know, it must be hideous, mustn't it? And I've watched mums come out for 15 days consecutively to try and feed a dead pup that's still on the beach. Their mothering instinct is so strong that if they can smell the pup, they will try and feed it even if it's being scavenged by gulls.
Sue estimates a couple of hundred seals are born around the Cornish coast each year, but recently the number of pups needing to be rescued has risen fast, as well as pups and adults washing up dead. Many of these casualties could be due to stormier seas.
Clearly seals are very competent in the water, massively agile and fantastically wonderful to look at. In a big storm swell, that is a real challenge. It's the biggest challenge for the youngest, smallest, weakest seals, but it's also a challenge for adults. In the last season, particularly after the storms, there were a lot of trauma injuries. Bashed heads, hemorrhages on the brain, broken jaws, cracked ribs, that kind of thing, when animals just lose control and crash against a rock in a big wave.
Climate change is also bringing heavier rain, which you might not think would bother a waterproof species.
The rain has been coming in extreme events and it saturates the rock, and then the rock slides, and it slides over a haul-out beach and seals get killed underneath the rockfall. We've had that happen on numerous occasions, but much worse than that is when it happens on a pupping cave in the pupping season. One of my favourite seals, I saw her just outside the cave just before the rockfall happened. I went the following week and I just couldn't believe the transformation in the cliff because it looks like a different place. I haven't seen her since, so I'm guessing that she and her pup and numerous other mums and pups would have been in those sea caves and perished.
Seals in Cornwall usually give birth between August and December, but Sue thinks that might change. As our winters become stormier, pups born earlier could become more successful. This might solve one problem, but could cause another, especially as Cornwall's tourist industry grows.
Most seal pups tend to be born in remoter places. Often on the north coast here, it's on beaches that are inaccessible, which is fine. However, a pup will leave the beach at 3 weeks, and those are the animals that tend to come into conflict with humans because they'll rock up on a public beach because they're exhausted and just want to sleep. It's a public beach and people just want to have a look. If you shift the cycles of the natural world, that interaction and conflict between us and nature is going to get worse.
They contain more minerals, more vitamins than any other food group. They have antiviral, antibacterial, anti-carcinogenic properties even. They can be used for antibiotics. They're just incredible. You can make everything out of it that is now produced by oil. It can solve the world's problems.
The Cornish Seaweed Company harvests some of the 650 species of seaweed from around the Lizard. Sales are doubling every year, so Tim's company has embarked on England's first ever project to farm sugar kelp.
We started the project 3 years ago with basically zero knowledge of any farming, and farming seaweed in Europe is a very new thing still. So we didn't know what to expect. In the first year we tried, we did everything wrong that we could have done wrong. So we didn't grow a single seaweed, which was almost encouraging really, because you want to make those mistakes when you start up and when everything is still small.
After these teething problems, the company is now growing several tons of sugar kelp on ropes at a floating mussel farm. Right now, it's all about food, but because kelp grows so fast, there could be an interesting side benefit in helping to suck up carbon.
There's definitely a lot more potential to store carbon in the sea compared to the land. To start with, trees take years to grow and actually start absorbing carbon, not until like 20 years or something, and that's too late. Whilst if you do seaweed, in 6 months, it grows 2 meters long. Immediately, you can start absorbing carbon. And there's just so much more space. One of the things that you can do is taking the sugar kelp and burying it in the deep sea where it will stay there for a long time, meaning that you can bury the carbon. It's not something that we're working on at the moment, but it's something we're definitely looking into.
Seaweed could help us to fight climate change in an even more surprising way too. We have over 300,000 cows in Cornwall, and each time they burp they release methane, a greenhouse gas that's tens of times more potent than carbon dioxide.
One of the ways seaweeds can be beneficial to the climate is to add about 2% dried seaweed, specific seaweeds called Asparagopsis taxiformis, to cattle feed, which then reduces cows from burping. So if we can grow that species, we can already help fight climate change. There is incredible potential to expand seaweed farms in Cornwall and further up in the UK as well. One of the problems that Cornwall has is a lot of storms coming from east, west, north and south. Seaweed farms can reduce wave height and thereby coastal erosion. So if there's areas in the UK or in the world that are prone to coastal erosion, it kind of makes sense to use seaweed farms to fit in front of them to dampen that impact of the sea.
The government wants all our homes to be powered by offshore wind by 2030, and this is going to mean huge amounts of underwater construction, pipelines and cables. But these things are usually encased in concrete to protect them, and concrete production itself actually releases huge amounts of carbon. Now one local company has come up with an ingenious low-impact alternative, involving this pile of Cornish china clay waste and what looks like a heap of old washing machines.
As divers, we'd seen the damage done to rocky reef habitats and limestone habitats through bottom trawling. You'll come across these trawl marks and absolute devastation in the seabed. And unfortunately, rock doesn't regrow. So we thought, let's come up with a way to recreate these rocky reef habitats and to provide sustainable homes for marine life. So they're made from a Portland-free concrete mix with recycled materials. It's 80% less carbon to produce our cubes. We need artificial reefs because there's a massive decline in our commercial fish stocks and marine species in a whole, worldwide. Primarily that's because of man's interaction with the ocean, and whether it's building offshore wind farms, oil and gas platforms, or trawling for shellfish, we've caused a lot of damage, and we need to act now to put something back and give the species somewhere they can grow up. They look very grey initially. Once they're deployed, after about 3 months, you'll have a very thick biofilm already adhering and covering the cubes, so a green browny colour, and that is the start of the reef build. And from that, you'll get barnacles, you'll get tube worms, you'll get kelps, we'll get seaweeds, will all adhere and start growing from the cubes.
James hopes they could also be used to help restore fragile habitats around the world that are already being affected by climate change. The company's trying to propagate coral onto the cubes and also trying to grow mangrove seedlings in them, which could help to build up coastal defences in low-lying tropical countries. But as sea levels rise and storms increase, they could help Cornwall too.
Cornwall's got a very, very long coastline with lots of open areas to the sea and coastal erosion. And if we can protect the coastline from the damage and from the storms and provide marine habitat for organisms, then it's a win-win. Our current production is probably 200 to 250 different size cubes per day, but we're hoping to upscale our manufacturing on a much larger scale with batching plants and other machinery. We could be producing maybe 2,000 to 3,000 cubes a day, and we need to do that to actually have an impact. Ultimate goal for 20 years time, I'd like to see reef cubes, or if not reef cubes, nature inclusive design used for all offshore construction. We've got the technology, we've got the know-how, and we shouldn't be building stuff in the sea if it's not going to benefit the sea life as well.
Increased storminess as our climate changes is a problem.
So that was just the just three of the stories from that first film. So I guess what the message we were trying to get across with that one, if you could just go back a slide, Helen, sorry, was that what we really need to be doing, you know, plastic pollution, something that the public is really on board with and is completely uncontroversial and everyone cares about, you know, it would be great if we could actually reframe it as just a part of the climate emergency. Obviously, you know, it is a part of the whole climate change problem. It's made from fossil fuel and it's emitting greenhouse gases at every stage in its journey. And also, you know, if we could take all the plastics out of the sea, it would, which is impossible, you know, that wouldn't actually address climate change, which is a sort of bigger overarching problem. But if we address climate change, then that will have an impact on plastic pollution itself already. Next slide, please, Helen. And not only, you know, is it emitting greenhouse gases throughout its whole journey, even now we know, you know, when it's left lying on beaches, it's emitting methane and ethylene and other really potent greenhouse gases. So yeah, plastic is part of the climate problem. It's not a problem on its own. Next slide, please. So the second film, sorry, I need to speed up, don't I? Second film, Plenty More Fish. We very quickly wanted to get onto this topic because we want to show that we're trying to create a big, broad tent here, and we're not creating films that are judgmental or finger pointy. And we really want to reach those sort of unengaged audiences of people who might not normally have been sort of involved in environmental discussions or would maybe not normally watch an environmental film. So this film, obviously, it's about climate change impacts on the Cornish fishing industry, and it's narrated by this wonderful guy, Ben Church, who is one of our local fishermen. Next slide, please. And yeah, it's got a whole load of very interesting stories in it. Again, it's not presenting fishermen as the enemy. I think it's been probably the most popular unexpectedly and most successful of all of the films because it's a film about fishing, but it's not bashing fishermen, and yet it's environmental. It's had well over 15,000 views so far, and it's actually been part of the official selection for the International Fishing Film Festival in Lorient in Brittany next week. Don't even know how they found out about it. So hopefully, you know, this is a really good vehicle for getting into communities that might not normally talk about these things and be able to then sort of start that whole climate conversation more broadly. Next slide, please. So these are just some of the topics that we cover in that film. There's some great sections in there with Steve Simpson from the University of Exeter, obviously, you know, fascinating and wonderful person. And interestingly, sort of looking at how fish are moving, you know, potentially it could actually spell benefits for the Cornish fishing industry because of the type of fish that we're having moving into our waters now, which are faster to reproduce than those cold water species that we're losing. But also, of course, it's really important to focus on the fact that this is actually devastating for people living in the tropics who depend so entirely on fish for protein in their diet, which are potentially losing fish and plankton populations altogether as those waters become too hot for anything else to move into. Next slide, please. And the last marine film that we've done is Living on the Edge. This was the last one that came out. It's presented by this woman, Emma Hazeldine, who's an amazing trail runner who just like runs crazy distances that don't seem human. This one's the one that's looking at everything to do with sea level rise and coastal erosion around Cornwall. And it's kind of presented by her as she runs the entire coast path, and then she sort of pops up in different places looking at what's happening and what communities are doing in those different places. Next slide, please. So we've got a whole host of different topics that we look at here as well. Some wonderful stuff from the Isles of Scilly. And again, you know, we're just trying to sort of focus on those stories that might not be the obvious ones that people might know about. You know, one of the major threats to Scilly, of course, you know, their highest point is only 55 metres above sea level. So they have an existential threat anyway, but more immediately, it's their drinking water, because 99% of their drinking water comes from the large inland freshwater lakes on the islands, but those are only separated from the sea by some quite low sand dunes, so it could very easily be inundated and the water could become, they could have salination ingress into the water, which would make it undrinkable. So looking at some projects to focus on issues like that there, and all sorts of other things, looking at, you know, how the shoreline around Cornwall, as most people don't know, has been divided up into hold the line, managed realignment, and no active intervention zones, and what that means for each place. And just the fact that, you know, so many communities, unlike Bude, which we focus on, you know, so many other places haven't even really started to address this issue, which is, you know, extremely important, because obviously you can't come up with a community plan to address what's going to happen to your village as a result of sea level rise or coastal erosion overnight, and yet you know, time's marching on and nothing's being done. That's just a little quote at the bottom from Herne Nasselink at the University of Plymouth, who again is wonderful and features in the film, and we were just really pleased to get such a great response from the experts who we've had in the films, as a way of helping them to get their message across too. We've also been using the film quite a bit with the Environment Agency, who've been coming out and have been finding it's a great vehicle for being able to sort of show more visually and understandably issues to communities, and to help them then have those conversations that need to be had as well. Next slide, please. So just to sort of wrap up, I think the discovery has been that climate change, you know, absolutely cuts across all the other environmental issues that we're facing in Cornwall, and indeed across the UK and the world, really, and very much specifically across the marine issues in the southwest. Obviously, it's not very often the only issue. It is a wicked problem because it's compounded with so many other things, which means that, you know, there's not very often a single solution either. But I think the films are doing a really good job at harnessing public engagement, and often because we're going through, you know, topics that are easier for the public to accept or aren't sort of seen as controversial, like plastic pollution, or on the film we're currently working on, it starts looking at sewage overflows. And we're getting an amazing response from the public and doing a lot of community engagement work. I'm just going down to Morland Smith tomorrow, actually, to go and do a screening of the latest film. Next slide, please, Helen. So not only are we going out and doing community screenings, but we're also doing quite a lot of work in secondary schools, which we're just starting now. There was research done recently by the campaign group Teach the Future, and they discovered these horrendous statistics. I mean, not really surprising from my perspective as the mother of two teenagers, finding out what they learn and don't learn about climate change at school. But you know, I think teachers definitely have been welcoming us with open arms, because they don't necessarily feel that they've got the space within the curriculum or the time, or maybe even the capacity to be able to teach about something where you could potentially be unleashing eco-anxiety and all sorts of things that you might not feel equipped to deal with. So we're doing school screenings and activities, and we're also doing the community screening. So if any of you are interested or would like us to come out and do a screening and discussion Q&A panel event with you, then we'd be absolutely delighted to. Next slide, please, Helen. So the film we've got coming out at the moment that we're frantically editing, hopefully will be ready by the end of this month. It's called Down the Drain. We're still kind of in the water, because this is, well, we are in the water. This is the one that's looking at everything to do with climate change and freshwater in Cornwall. It's being presented by someone you probably know, Rupert Kirkwood, the lone kayaker. And it's fantastic. It's got all sorts of exciting and unusual stories in it. And then we've got a whole host of other themes coming up in the remaining films of the series that will be made over the next couple of years. Next slide, please. Oh, and that's it. Sorry, I've been a little bit over time, but thank you very much for listening, and very happy to take any questions if anyone's got any.
Thank you so much, Claire. That was brilliant. I'm going to give you a round of applause. Thank you. I'll just see if we've got any questions for you. So Nicole said, how many episodes were there from these documentaries? How many minutes, and how can we access them? So I think somebody's probably put a link in the chat there.
Yeah, so we've got the 3 films so far, and the 4th one is coming out at the end of March. They're well, this one's going to be a bit longer, but they're roughly 30 minutes long. And yes, hopefully you've got the web link on the chat, but you can see them all on there for free.
And Brendan's said he's wholly convinced by community screenings, but wondered if you could outline what you see as the dividends.
Well, I think it's what we're hoping is that they really just sort of start conversations in communities, because obviously, you know, we have a lot of similar problems across Cornwall, but, you know, somewhere in Redruth is not going to be the same sort of communities as, you know, us here in Corsand. So hopefully they just sort of stimulate those conversations so that communities can start to look at what are our biggest threats here, what are our biggest opportunities, what can we do as a community, and really sort of they're just sort of a stimulant to get the ball rolling in different places. And because we've got more, you know, as we get more and more films in the series, what we're finding is that we're being asked to go and show maybe 2 films, so communities can kind of pick and mix and choose the ones that they think are most relevant to their place.
Great, thank you. Andy has asked, are you trying to reach visitors with the films to engage tourists?
Yeah, so we're actually expanding a little bit. We're just taking on a couple of people to help, because I'm just sort of running around like this crazy headless chicken, balancing plates and juggling balls. And what we really want to do, because each film is almost, well, it is a discrete thing to itself with a whole kind of ecosystem around it, we're taking on somebody to now investigate more all the different sorts of events and publications and every possible outlet for these films, sort of locally and more nationally and even internationally. And also sort of looking at those big events that happen in the summer, the festivals, the food festivals. Mervagissy have been talking to us about maybe having a screening in the harbour during the summer, you know, events at Eden, stuff like that, to sort of, I think particularly actually with that fishing film, which seems to be the one that really engages people, you know, so that visitors who have come here to enjoy all our loveliness in the summer can actually sort of get a bit more of an idea of what's going on beneath the surface and take that home to their lives as well.
Brilliant, thank you. Paul has asked who's funding this activity.
Yeah, well, we were incredibly lucky. So we started out with quite a generous bequest from somebody who was just cared very much about the environment. So that enabled us to make the first 3 films independently, which has been fantastic for us because there wasn't any time pressure. Obviously, we've put quite a lot of pressure on ourselves just because we're in a climate emergency. We've been trying to make a film every 4 months. We're going to have to slow down a bit in a minute because we're going to get burned out otherwise. But it also meant that we could just sort of tell the stories we wanted to tell without any funders' agenda. But we've also been fundraising. We've had quite a lot of donations. We did a crowdfunder, which we raised quite a lot of money from to make one of the films. We've had some funding from Natural England and the lottery. So we're kind of in the black at the moment, but you know, we're always we're always looking for more. But it costs us approximately 20,000 to make each film. I know you look at a half-hour film and can't imagine how much work goes into that probably, but it's absolutely immense. And we've got a lot of people behind the scenes who are going out to help us. So there's quite a lot of yeah, it's not a cheap thing to do.
Great. Andy's also added Lundy are having a festival this year, and it might be an opportunity to expand your reach, albeit in Devon.
That would be absolutely amazing. I'd love to get details about that if that would be possible, because actually, you know, another one of those stories in the first film is Ruth Williams talking about highly protected marine areas, with Cornwall hopefully piloting some of the first ones. But she does mention Lundy, and we have some shots of Lundy in there, so that might be a really nice tie-in. Great,
thank you. And Bob has asked, what is your answer to people who ask what they can do? Who do you refer them to?
Oh, it is difficult. It is really difficult, isn't it? Because, you know, unlike the plastic thing, it's just that thing that overwhelms us all and makes us feel kind of helpless. So if you go on our website, each one of the films has its own little section of what you can do. So which are kind of more tailored answers relating to things that are actually within those specific films. So that's a really good place to start, and that gives links on to other actions that people can take as well.
Great, thank you very much, Claire. I don't think there's any more questions. So with that, I'll give you another round of applause and say thanks again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you. Sorry I went on so long.
That's all right. Yeah, if you have any more questions for Claire, do just ping me an email and I can pass them on. But yeah, and just a reminder as well that we have our the next Southwest Marine Ecosystem webinar is next Wednesday at 12 o'clock, and we'll be joined by Sue Sayer and the Cornwall Seal Group Research Trust, who will telling us all about Cornwall seals. So thank you very much, everyone, and thanks again, Claire.
Thank you.